I don't think there's any issue with that, Colleen.
Yeah, thank you.
So
All
hopefully
right.
everyone, can you see my screen, Colleen?
I can see you. Yep.
Okay. Sorry, pulling up the chat here in case anyone has any questions. If I've recognized a few names, so welcome back to some of you that have been with us so far. Today we're going to talk about housing. If you've been on these webinars so far, you've probably noticed that they're very broad overviews. Again, the end goal with this series is to keep building on them each year. So hopefully we'll keep adding more information, but these basic level webinars will be available as recordings, and please ask good questions today so we can fill in all that basic knowledge that you all are craving. And I make a point to say that for this webinar, because when talking about sow housing, it's going to be different depending on what part of the country you're in. So far, most of the responses I've seen have indicated that most people are up north. So I've seen a lot of Michigan, Vermont, New Hampshire. I'm in Pennsylvania and it gets pretty cold here. But if you happen to be down in the south, or we happen to get some people that sign on here from Texas like we had with the boar webinars, that housing situation is going to be really, really different. So the scope of this talk is focused much more on what those pigs actually need in housing, rather than a specific type of housing. So we'll go ahead and get started. And maybe I should note that I've got some cute pictures in here, but I don't think I would recommend quite an adorable little house for a pig up in Vermont that looks quite like this one, or up in Michigan. I would think there'd be a lot of snow that would get in all those big openings. So maybe something that'll be a little bit more sturdy as we talk through this. So pig housing. I believe that pig housing is absolutely necessary. If you are raising livestock, especially if you're raising livestock in cold temperatures, housing is something most people consider important. Though that can be discussed a little bit between species. If you have cattle, cattle handle the cold weather far better than many other livestock species. So housing with cattle is a little bit of a different discussion. But when it comes to pigs, almost regardless of where you raise pigs, you need to have some form of housing for those animals. And a lot of that has to do with because things change. The weather changes daily. It's good to see that most people are experiencing sunny, breezy, and cool today. It is that way in Pennsylvania as well, but we're expecting to get some storms this afternoon. So hopefully all of our pigs will have somewhere to run in. Of course, we have changing seasons. Again, just about everybody that I've seen log on has indicated they're up north, so you have 4 seasons. You know that it's going to be different in January for housing your pigs. We're talking reproduction, so you're probably going to have pigs on your farm in January if you're breeding them, versus what type of housing or what the weather conditions are going to be in August. Pigs in general have a lack of what I like to call physiological resistance to extreme changes in weather. They don't have terribly thick hides. They don't have very thick hair, fur, coat, wool. They, generally speaking, the most insulation and cover that they have is however much back fat they have on. When we're raising animals, and we'll talk a lot more about nutrition next week, when we're raising animals, we're striving to manage that back fat. And so we can't rely on it as a safety net or a cover for a pig. So when that's all the physiological resistance they have, or the backup to deal with changing weather conditions and seasons, we have to be aware that that's not great for them. And in addition to that, pigs also have a couple other handicaps when it comes to changing weather and extremes, because they don't have functional sweat glands. I have on here they don't have sweat glands, but physiologically speaking, they don't have functional sweat glands. They have sweat glands in their feet that are keratinized that don't allow them to actually release any moisture. And pigs also tend to sunburn. White pigs tend to sunburn more often than pigs that have some kind of color on them, but even pigs that have color on them can sunburn. So this is, again, just another one of those, they have a lack of general physiological resistance, And that's not to say they're going to get sick more often. It's not to say that they're going to die if they live outside. It's to say that we have to take appropriate care of them if we're going to be raising them as a livestock animal. And then, of course, there's changing climate and extremes. When we are talking about how we take care of an animal that is sensitive to extremes, which pigs are, we need to be aware that the housing situation is changing from year to year. We just had Isaias, the hurricane, come up the East Coast here. I don't know how much of any of you got to see that rain and the high winds, but it came through pretty quickly. Any pig that's housed in a situation where they couldn't get under appropriate shelter probably had to deal with a lot of that rain. I lived in the Midwest for quite some time. Having buildings that are sturdy enough to withstand tornadoes is an absolute must out in the Midwest. The few times that I have seen straight line winds or tornadoes take out a building, it is terrifying and devastating. So when we're talking about housing, we're talking about pigs that need to be taken care of. We have to think about what we're facing with that housing and what those pigs need. So that's why housing is so important and why I consider it a must for raising pigs. But let's take a step back. I said that we're going to talk about what these pigs actually need. And so regardless of what breed of pig you are rearing, and we have pigs that have general lack of physiological resistance, we should start at what their ideal is. Now, the ideal for pigs from a research standpoint is developed off of commodity produced pigs, tends to be white Yorkshire landrace based sow, tends to be a Duroc or a white sire, very fast growing, lean pigs. So I'll put that caveat here with this thermal neutral zone. That's where most of the research is based on. That said, even if you have pigs that carry a lot of excessive fat, or pigs that generally live outside or have lived outside for generations, they're still going to have a fairly narrow thermal neutral zone that they can tolerate. So let's define the thermal neutral zone. The thermal neutral zone is an environmental temperature range that allows the pig to prioritize its nutrients into meat or reproductive tissues. Okay, so pigs that are built to put on a lot of lean tissue have a very, very high metabolic demand. They produce a lot of heat. If you have a line of pigs that tends to put on more fat, they don't grow terribly fast, your pigs are not necessarily going to produce a lot of heat, so their thermal neutral zone is going to be adjusted. When we're talking about reproductive tissues, that is the same conversation, only the tissue that the animal is building is a different type of tissue. So in meat production, we're putting on muscle. In reproductive animals, we are building offspring. So that same animal that you are housing has a thermal neutral zone. During a stage of production, they have this narrow range that they are most comfortably housed in, and then their stage of production and their breed influences it just a little bit. And in most mature pigs, now that I've given a whole bunch of caveats about that thermal neutral zone, that thermal neutral zone is classified as anywhere between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. I can hear in the back of my head, I can hear some people saying, oh, well, my pigs stay outside all winter. They survive 30 degrees Fahrenheit. They survive 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is where we have to think about why we're raising pigs. You can say survive. Sure, your pigs are surviving in 30-degree weather or surviving in 40-degree weather. But when we're rearing them, we want them to thrive. We don't want them to just survive. And so that 50 to 75 degree range of that thermal neutral zone is indicating when that pig is comfortable and when that pig is able to prioritize its nutrients to your agricultural goal, rather than trying to just survive an environmental situation. So, good thing with reproductive and breeding stock, they can handle colder temperatures. 50 to 75 is ideal. They can handle appropriately 40 degrees, 30 degrees, 20 degrees, 10 degrees, or colder. However, as we drop further into those low temperatures, that tissue production is going to suffer. This is particularly important if we are trying to grow offspring or we're trying to breed our sows after a long winter or in the middle of a particularly harsh winter. That tissue production takes a lot of energy to produce. So most of the nutrients that you are feeding your pig should be going towards some form of tissue production, be it meat or offspring. Your reproductive stock should be putting it towards offspring, or for your boars should be putting it towards sperm production, and just that general high maintenance that boars have. Nutrients that they consume can also go towards heat production. They want to maintain that body temperature, that ideal body temperature. Those are very often at conflict in cold weather. So maintaining body temperature is critical for survival. Animals, mammals have to have a certain body temperature in order for that mammal to survive. Producing additional heat and keeping that body temperature up takes a lot more energy in the wintertime if we're not providing appropriate housing, because they lose that body heat through their skin, and then they have to just continually produce more to keep their body temperature up. And so when that situation happens and we have pigs that are in chronically cold weather where they cannot get into a warm housing situation, it's going to continue to force them to burn nutrient energy and prevent them from building the tissues they need to build. So when that happens and we have pigs that are chronically cold, what does the end outcome look like? The end outcome looks like pigs that are struggling to survive, particularly if they're small or thin. It looks like pigs that have a hard time holding on to the heat that is produced. And it looks like pigs that are increasing their digestive processes. If they need energy in order to produce energy and keep their body heat up, they're going to have a higher metabolic demand. They're going to be hungrier. They're going to want to eat more. And so their digestive organs are going to be, I don't want to say hyperactive, but they're going to be functioning at a much more efficient rate than they would normally. So what does a cold pig look like? Cold pigs have hair that stands up, hair that grows on end. A pig that is not cold doesn't generally look fluffy unless you have a Mangalista or you happen to have a pig that has for generations lived outside and so the coat has evolved. Generally speaking, pigs don't look terribly fluffy. If your pig looks fluffy or it looks like its hair is standing on end, it's probably cold. Pigs huddle together when they are cold. Pig piles are adorable when we are talking about small little pigs that are in a perfectly warm farrowing stall and they have their hot spot and they're just cuddling together. But a true pig pile, like our picture here where the pigs are so on top of each other that you can't distinguish their legs from their heads, is not adorable. That's a sign of very, very cold pigs. Whereas pigs that just touch each other are in that ideal temperature zone, and pigs that are avoiding each other are probably too hot. Pigs that are too cold tend to burrow into their straw or bedding. Now, if you are providing adequate straw or bedding, they are going to find that comfortable spot and kind of hang out there if you have nice, dense, dry bedding. Pigs that are really cold and they don't necessarily have enough bedding are going to throw that bedding over themselves. They're going to pile it into corners. They are going to destroy any reasonable layout of that bedding just to try and build a spot where they can hold heat. Your pigs won't necessarily want to leave their housing when they're cold. If you feed them outside, they might come out to eat. They might come out to investigate you dropping off food. They might have to come out for water. But if they are too cold, they will generally just stay in their housing. Pigs that are comfortable will wander out even in the wintertime. They'll wander out onto the snow. They'll hang out in the sun. Much like our girls here, they're actually pretty far from their housing and there is snow on the ground, but because the sun was out and they were comfortable, they wandered out. During the year when our girls are cold here on campus, it's very, very hard to get them out of their buildings. So we make a point of adding additional straw bedding. We make a point of making sure that their houses are as comfortable as possible so that when they do come outside, they have that rigor, they have that additional coat and energy to actually wander outside and deal with the elements. And then of course I said that when pigs are cold, they are burning far more energy in heat production and they're not putting on tissue. So chronically cold pigs, you will notice that they will get thinner over the winter. They will lose weight. And that is often in despite of the fact that they are eating more or drinking more. They might be spending more time at the feeder. You might have to fill their feeder out more often, or they might be a little bit more aggressive at feeding time, indicating that they need more feed. Yet they will be getting progressively thinner throughout the winter if they are cold. So housing and meeting pigs' needs in cold weather should be with a goal of keeping heat in and to lower that pig maintenance energy burn. So some suggestions if we're thinking about trying to keep pigs warm in the wintertime, particularly mature pigs, we want to think about housing sows together whenever possible, yet we want to keep boars separate. Again, this goes back to in the wintertime, our pigs are burning far more energy to keep themselves warm in most cases than they are during the summertime. Housing sows together in the wintertime is a good way to conserve all of their collective heat and allows those animals to reach a more comfortable temperature within the barn, but it's also going to keep their fighting down. Mixing sows frequently or mixing sows often and not allowing them to get used to a group that they're in will trigger their hierarchical, I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time with that word today, hierarchy. It'll trigger their hierarchy and want them to behave in a manner that will set the pecking order, and so they'll fight if you continue to mix them or if you house them separately and keep bringing them together. Housing them together is a good way to minimize that, so have them fight only a few times when they're first mixed together, or be very familiar with each other so that they will not fight and not burn that additional energy, but still be housed in a way where they can conserve that heat that is produced and benefit each other. Boars, on the other hand, for the most part, reproductively active boars will just continue to fight if they are not routinely housed together in general, or if you are using them for mating, it's still advised to house them separately. So in this situation, and we mentioned before with selection of boars and sows, you don't really want to house your boars with your sows. It's much better to have your boar kept in a separate building from the sows, despite the fact that he is putting off a lot of heat and you would want to capture some of that heat. So the best of your ability, keeping that boar separate, either from other boars to keep them from fighting or from other sows to not influence those estrus cycles or to keep that energy burn low, is highly advised in that situation. The exception for sows would be if you are in farrowing. Generally speaking, sows should be housed separately in farrowing, despite any temperature concerns, so that they can keep track of that litter. The sow herself can handle cold temperatures. However, the smaller pigs need to be kept quite warm. When you have sows that are in a group farrowing situation, unless you create spaces for those small pigs to go and get warm and draw them away from the larger group of sows, you're more likely to have issues with sows laying on pigs, particularly laying on pigs that are not their own. So in this housing winter versus summer discussion, making sure that you have that housing appropriately separated based on that stage of production. So sows that don't have a litter on them can be housed together, whereas sows that have a litter on them or in farrowing should be housed separately. Boars kept separate as often as possible as well. Housing should also, when we're considering holding in heat for the winter time, you should utilize body condition scoring to help you keep track of how adequate your housing is. One of the more surprising visits I had with a farm, I was talking to a producer that was telling me he was having some issues with getting his sows to breed back over the winter time. I said, okay, there's definitely some things we can talk about here. It might be nutrition, it might be an illness, it really could be a lot of different things. But when I went into his facilities, I noticed that his sows were particularly skinny, which is, from my perspective, quite alarming. And the further we moved into the barn, it was noticeable that the facilities he kept the pigs in just did not hold their heat at all. And he'd been keeping them in these facilities for a significant amount of time. And so he was new to sow production. He hadn't had too many sows before and didn't realize that the sensitivity they had to cold. He was much more adept to producing cattle. And so we had to have a long discussion where his sows were probably very good to start with, but now that they've burned all of the energy off, they're now just very cold and they're not able to breed back because the housing was inappropriate. So utilizing body condition score can tell you quite a bit about how adequate your housing is for your reproductive herd. This is a really important tool, which I know I've talked about in some of the other series. And I can't stress the importance of body condition scoring enough when it comes to managing your reproductive herd. Because of the continued examples we have here, the more you manage that body condition score or utilize it to evaluate how well your animal is doing, it can influence a lot of aspects of that reproductive herd management. And in this case, you can utilize it to tell you about how well your animals are handling a housing situation, particularly in the wintertime, because you're going to notice more changes in muscle condition and fat cover in the wintertime due to animals that are cold as opposed to in the summertime. So I spent a lot of time talking about cold weather. Cold weather, I like to make a point of talking about that first because I think sometimes it gets overlooked. Climate change is a big topic. We're talking about how the world is getting warmer, but we do still have seasons, and it's very easy to not realize how cold some of your livestock can be, especially when a lot of animals are very, very efficient at keeping themselves warm in cold weather. Pigs need a hand. So we start out talking about the cold temperature. In the long run, though, as the world gets warmer and we have to deal with increasingly hot summers, I don't know exactly how hot it got a couple weeks ago way up north, but in Pennsylvania, we hit 100 degrees a couple weeks ago, which is, for the most part, pretty uncommon in central PA. So we know that it's getting hotter out. And so we have to deal with the ramifications of that. And it's much, much harder to cool pigs down than it is to warm them up. So if we're talking about cold temperatures in the wintertime, a solid structure should help you keep those pigs warm. In the summertime, it's far more difficult to get those pigs cold or to cool those pigs down once they're too hot. So when we're talking about hot temperatures and utilizing housing, the goal really needs to be about trying to get them as cool as possible. For mature pigs, or usually pigs over 100 pounds, we'll push it to 150 depending on how fast your pigs are growing. Once those temperatures start to exceed, those outdoor temperatures or environmental temperatures start to exceed 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you are going to see pigs that are going to very quickly move into life-threatening levels of heat stress. life-threatening levels, but I mean, they just have a complete inability to cool themselves down. And this is prolonged heat stress for several days at a time over 80 degrees. In a normal diurnal day, you will see, the sun rises, the sun sets, it gets cooler at night, hotter during the day. That 80-degree temperature encompasses all the time. So if you have pigs in a facility, and so if you have pigs in a building and it happens to get above 80 degrees and you can't get that building cooled down, that is a detrimental situation to those pigs that could potentially become life-threatening, as opposed to pigs that are living outside in the summertime where the temperature that they are in fluctuates much more with the sunshine. Again, in the heat, the primary physiological goal is with maintaining body temperature. Much like it is in the cold, that pig is going to put much more energy and effort into maintaining their body temperature, keeping it from getting too cold. In the heat, they're going to reverse that effort. They're going to reduce the amount of body heat that is produced and try to just allow natural body heat that is there, to go off of them naturally. So just kind of waft off of them. I noticed a comment in the chat that you've had more 90-degree days than ever here in the mountains. Humidity is high, yeah. So it's been really hot, and that's a really good point for how hot it's been, and to make sure that we keep pigs cool. Pigs don't sweat. They have that keratinized sweat gland, so they're not able to release heat that way, though they do utilize evaporative cooling. I appreciate Wendy's comment that she's had to water them down and hose them down several times a day. Pigs don't sweat on their own, so they don't release their own water to evaporate, but they do utilize evaporative cooling really well, so hosing them down is a good strategy. And a lot of that is because they are dense animals and they have to maximize what little surface area they have to express heat through water, through their ears, through panting. Pigs that are very, very hot will, for the most part, just lay down on their side. They'll find water to lay down in, and they will pant, leave their ears up. They're just trying to get as much heat off of their body as possible. And when a pig is putting all of its effort into effectively not moving, it's not going to want to eat. It's not going to exercise its muscles. It's not going to get up and walk around. So you're going to have tissues start to break down. There are also physiological processes that are still being investigated about how muscle breaks down in a heat stress situation in a pig, and how intestinal tissue literally can die in a heat stress situation in a pig. Research out of Iowa State that was published, I believe it was published in 2016, found evidence of intestinal tissue dying, and basically a septic response to chronically heat stressed pigs, that their body essentially goes into an illness state where their immune system is activated because the tissue is no longer functioning the way it needs to, and in some cases is starting to die. And that can trigger additional issues in a very, very warm pig or very, very hot pig, in addition to just tissue production not happening, that pig not getting up to eat, that pig having a difficult time lowering its body temperature. So heat stress, because it's such a big deal, again, there's a lot of research that is going into heat stress right now. There is a quite handy graph that's been developed. Iowa State University developed this in 2002 that kind of shows, again, for fast growing pigs, where their general heat stress emergency, heat stress alert situation is, and then no heat stress. I did adapt this graph a little bit, and that's to add this no heat stress situation. And that's because heat stress research is based on when those pigs are no longer able to perform at their peak. So it's important to identify that we can assume they are not in heat stress if they are performing as they normally would. And in a situation where you don't necessarily have a fast growing modern genetics, or you don't necessarily have elite commercial facilities in order to specifically manage your pig's environment, and you have to adapt, I think it's a little bit more important to highlight how those levels look, so that you can make your own adjustments based on your observations of how your pigs behave in a heat stress situation. So at any rate, this graph shows temperature, which we have in Celsius for the for those that are inclined to use the metric system or the Celsius system. Then we have Fahrenheit here, and then relative humidity. What you'll notice is as relative humidity goes up on this graph, that dry bulb temperature, or that environmental temperature, is going to go down or will be lower when heat stress emergencies start. I mentioned earlier that pigs utilize evaporative cooling quite efficiently, but when it's really humid out, we know as people that when you sweat and you can't get that sweat off your body, it just makes it that much hotter out because of the humidity. Same thing, evaporative cooling does not work as well when the humidity is too high. So that temperature of where heat stress could be induced is going to be lower, that dry bulb temperature, when the humidity is higher. So in your operations, when you're thinking about potential comfort levels for your animals, it's pretty important to make sure that you look at both the relative humidity here, which is usually reported out in daily weather, and then that temperature of where your pigs are housed to predict when they may or may not be in a heat stress situation. All right, so pigs can enter into heat stress based off of some temperatures, what we know about their physiology, but what actually does a heat stress pig look like? Heat stress pigs, I have on here activity increases at night, though that's probably a little bit confusing, but they will switch to a slightly more nocturnal type of behavior. When it's cool outside, they will get up, is kind of the perspective here. They will get up and move around much, much more when it's cool outside. One of the key pieces of advice for keeping pigs well in hot temperatures is to feed them early in the morning or very, very late at night, so that they've had some time to recover from those hot temperatures and they have the energy to get up and get to feed again. Pigs will tend to seek and waste water when they are very, very hot. If you have pigs that are housed in a completely indoor facility, they will play with any kind of nipple waters, and they'll spray water into the air, and they'll create little puddles on the concrete, and they'll play in the concrete. If you happen to have your pigs outside, they will create wallows. They will dig holes. They'll want to lay in the cool soil. If there's a water source, they'll go lay in the water source. They might create their own wallow by spilling water, etc. They are going to seek water, and depending on your climate and your environment, they're probably going to waste a little bit of it. I see someone has asked about installing sprinkler systems such as coolers. Yes, absolutely. When we get to housing, I'll point out a little bit more about that stuff, but evaporative cooling is really effective. Having sprinklers and what we refer to in the Midwest, well, and Pennsylvania too, as cool cells on the barns. Those are really useful for maintaining pig temperature. Pigs that are really hot will pant. They will sit. They'll act very, very lethargic. So pigs that aren't feeling well in general, they'll tend to sit like a dog a little bit more often than full lay down or full stand up. They'll be panting quite a bit, much like our friend here with the fan blowing on him. And they'll just in general be really lethargic. Eating will be a low priority for them, especially when it's at peak heat. They will not get up to find food. They will pretty much just ignore any food that's placed in front of them. And in extreme heat stress, you might even see some vomiting. Again, we have that intestinal tissue that is compromised in extreme heat stress, and any compromise to the digestive system can result in unwanted either diarrhea or vomiting, more often vomiting with that corruption of the intestinal tissue. So reproductively speaking, when we look at these two potential situations for housing pigs, we can look at prolonged cold and look at our adult animals and say, okay, prolonged cold is bad, predominantly from the perspective of inducing weight loss, and then subsequently can have an impact on offspring loss. Either you won't be able to produce a litter, or that litter will struggle significantly in continued cold temperatures. Reproductively speaking, heat has a much more difficult to directly observe, but almost more devastating to your whole production system overall. So housing design is focused quite a bit on how do we make sure that we get pigs cool right now than it is about keeping them warm. So we absolutely want insulation to keep them warm, but every other aspect of modern pig housing, you know, is almost solely designed around keeping pigs cool. Again, from the reproductive herds, from the reproductive herd standpoint, we are going to lose litters due to heat stress boars, where sperm death will occur, or we'll have lower sperm quality. Major impacts to sperm quality can last for 30 to 60 days, depending on how bad the testes were damaged, or how bad that sperm, or where in development that sperm was impacted as a result of the heat stress. In sows, you're going to have oocyte breakdown that can lead to either low litter sizes or smaller number of pigs per litter, or reduced farrowing rates. Research that I helped conduct out at Iowa State looked at oocyte quality. So that oocyte quality from a heat-stressed animal is reduced in its ability to form a blastocyst or an embryo. So the end ability of that animal to actually produce offspring is compromised in a chronically heat-stressed sow. And then, of course, inhibited estrus expression. Many producers see this in heat-stressed sows, where the sow just won't come into heat. She won't show any signs of heat. She won't go into a standing estrus. And so it makes it really difficult to know where she is in her cycle, if she is cycling at all. She might not be cycling at all, and to get her bred in the first place. So reproductively speaking, this is why this talk on housing it spends quite a bit of time on temperature. But as I said in the beginning, ideal housing really depends on where you are. I threw up a couple different examples of housing here, and I'll get back to the comment about using sprinkler systems and coolers. In these modern barns, now this is a finishing barn, it's not a sow barn. In the modern barns where we have automated inlets, the inlets that allow, so inlets at the top of the barn that allow air in, curtain sided to allow air out, lots of fans to pull air across pigs. Those very often utilize sprinkler systems to keep the animals cool. They have set temperatures in those barns. When the temperature within the barn reaches a certain level, it triggers fans to turn on. If that temperature goes higher, it triggers more fans to turn on. If that temperature reaches a certain height where they can no longer move enough air over those pigs, the curtains will fall down to allow free flow air through the barn. And then if in that situation, all of that air movement is still not quite enough, sprinklers can be turned on to cool the pigs down, and then the force of air being pulled across those pigs with the fans or through the curtains will help cool those pigs down by effectively drying them off. So this is what it looks like inside one of those barns pretty often. Now there's a lot of pigs in there, so having a lot of the automated tools is really useful to make sure air keeps moving, because all of these pigs are producing a lot of heat. But it is really clean in there, and it is really dry in there. So that helps those pigs manage that temperature, or their own body temperature, a lot more effectively. Hoop houses are really popular, particularly out in this part of the country, or if you're shooting for an organic-based system. Hoop houses are quite effective in your ability to either close off the side and to conserve some of that heat, allow excess heat to escape through the top, or to just open up the side and allow free flow air. Hoop houses are a little bit more complicated if you want to add automated systems. So you could add sprinklers, but the automation is going to be a little bit more difficult. The hoop house is effectively just the fully manual version of the automated modern pig house here. You could effectively think of it as driving an automatic car versus driving stick. The hoop house is going to be the stick, and this is going to be the fully automatic car. Those are generally the most popular forms of pig housing, particularly if you're going to put large groups of pigs together, or if you're going to have reproductive stock that you're going to keep over the winter time or over the summertime, and you want to keep them in a singular place. Other operations will shoot for these three-sided facilities where there's a lot of open space, minimal automation, but they do have some modern water access and whatnot here. This is a facility in California, and there are facilities that are like this pretty frequently in the South. And so this is, again, just to keep those facilities clean. They want to provide the pigs some kind of housing away from inclement weather, but for the most part, it's so nice there most of the time that they don't put a lot of effort into having a fully enclosed house or having to worry about winter time. Similarly, this image is of some pigs out on pasture in Texas, and this is our boar out on the pasture lots here at Penn State. At Penn State, we have these huts, mostly enclosed huts. They have a single door and then a row of windows off the back, and that's about it for airflow. So you can see from this wide variety of housing types that it depends far more on where you're located, as opposed to what type of housing you want. But each end goal of all of these different houses is to make sure that it maintains temperatures for pigs that are appropriate given the outdoor surroundings, that they can be dried out, and that they will protect those animals from inclement weather. I did want to throw in here a little bit about ventilation matters, and I'm going to work with our Penn State experts to get a little bit more customized information here for pig producers on building their own facilities with ventilation. But when it comes down to, again, this broad overview of pig housing, we want to make sure that air movement happens. Air movement is really important at all stages of pig production. However, for your reproductive herd, it's pretty difficult to get the air moving too fast through a facility. And that is when you have cold weather or hot weather. It's really, really important to keep air moving through that facility. You want to make sure that you're moving CO2 out and you're bringing oxygen in for those pigs, regardless of the time of year. So making sure that you're setting up your pig housing with the ability to keep that air moving is pretty critical. When it comes down to housing specs, again, we want to make sure that we have those pigs well covered from weather and changes in weather and changes in season. But for the most part, it needs to meet your needs. You want to make sure that that housing is keeping those pigs comfortable, but is something that works on your property as well. Building a facility that has optimal drainage when you are on dry land doesn't doesn't necessarily work for everyone. Or putting in excessive amounts of insulation down here in Pennsylvania as compared to Maine is just not necessarily something that we want to do in the wintertime. So the resource that I have here at the bottom is a really great resource for templates on how to build housing needs, and it addresses each one of these roofing or access to the facility by the pigs or by yourself, how to maintain airflow through that facility, appropriate insulation and drainage, and then necessary flexibility of that facility, either across seasons or across your production goals. And so the last thing I wanted to bring up here for housing with pigs in general are pastures and wallows. So neither pastures or wallows are technically housing for pigs. Pastures are an area where you hold pigs, and in the summertime, if you happen to have good weather and good tree stand and somewhere for those pigs to get out of the rain, it can act as effective good animal holding in most situations. So in that particular situation, it's not always inappropriate. So I can't say that pasture is inappropriate, but it's also not always appropriate. Holding pigs out in a pasture lot during the wet spring or all winter long without providing some kind of additional sturdy housing would generally not follow our rules of wanting to make sure we keep our pigs as comfortable as possible so that they can continue to produce for us. And it's not great for the pastures either, which brings me around to wallows. I just spent a whole bunch of time telling you how heat is really critical for your reproductive herd. You want to make sure that you keep your animals cool. Wallows are one way to do that. Unfortunately, wallows can be very damaging to the ground that you're on or to the lot that you're putting your pigs in. They can reduce vegetation growth. Again, you're going to have water wastage, or you're going to have runoff with that buildup of mud and that either drying or if you're on a slope. But almost more importantly than those are, for your reproductive herd, a wallow is going to be a pathogen hub. And I won't harp too much on that. There's a lot of disease talks available, and we can have a specific talk on brucellosis or leptospirosis. But from a reproductive herd standpoint, managing that herd and managing those wallows is really important to keep those pathogen loads down so that you're not infecting your pigs and then reducing your ability to have a highly productive reproductive herd. So I will try to sum up quickly here since I went just a couple minutes over. Regardless of temperature, regardless of some differences in your operation, you want to make sure that you are providing housing that keeps pigs comfortable so that they are prioritizing those nutrients towards producing for your operation. In order to keep them comfortable, we have to keep it dry. You have to keep it at the appropriate temperature. I have insulated on here, but the appropriate temperature for the time of year. Make sure that air can flow through it, and make sure that it's built sturdy. I have here our little pig straw house, and we're less worried about the big bad wolf with the sturdy build, and we're more worried about the bored destructive pig or the extreme weather when we're talking about sturdy building of housing for pigs. So maybe a little bit of a long story short, when you are thinking about keeping your mature pigs housed, we want to make sure that we are keeping them as comfortable as possible and as well protected as possible. So I do see I already have one more question in the chat, so I won't leave this up too much. I'll put the summary slide back up. I'll try to get those answered. So any comments on niche situations when you're in an agroforestry situation, wanting to clean up acorns in a woodlot, but provide housing for maximum protection? That's a great question. So my first answer to that is going to ask you what time of year you are probably going to put them out in that wooded lot. So for cleaning up acorns, I'm going to think in the fall. You are probably going to have a fairly dense tree stand in the early fall. I don't know my acorn development life cycle, so off the top of my head, I don't know when those normally fall. But if that's before the leaves have come off the trees and you are in a really dense tree stand, I think your pigs will be okay in early fall when it's still fairly warm with lots of leaves on the trees for the most part. Once you start moving into winter and those leaves have started to fall off the trees, their ability to get wet is going to be your concern because the temperatures are dropping, and the wetter your pigs get, the more they have to hang out in wet soils or on that wet forest litter. That's going to increase or decrease their ability to hold heat, increase their chances of getting sick. Or not being as well protected. So that leaf cover, that top leaf cover is going to be probably one of your more important considerations for time of year. Forestry is really hard to actually get a good building that's non-stationary because for the most part you have to clear out trees. I think if you are shooting for something where you can use the forestry land a little bit more throughout the year, it would be more advised to have a stationary housing point and then move your pigs daily to wherever you want to hold them for that day to clean out that woodlot, clear up acorns, or whatever land clearing you're hoping to do in that particular situation. Because again, building in a tree stand without actually taking out the trees is really difficult. So I would suggest having a common place to house your pigs and then transporting them daily, having them walk there, or trailering them to where you want to take them as often as possible. But when the trees are on, you probably consider them fairly well protected in most weather when the leaves are on the trees. When farrowing, do you recommend keeping sows and piglets near other sows but separate from other sows or in different building? Can you have farrowing sows in the same building as a boar if a separate pen? So I'll try to answer the first one. So what I think you're asking is, can you have a sow and piglet under the same roof? Yes, they can be under the same roof. So you have a sow with her piglets and you can have her right next to a sow with other piglets. There's nothing wrong with that. The separate housing for farrowing there is the separate pen or a wall divider. The concern there is that pigs tend to get across pens if you just if you have a group farrowing situation and you have many huts, to say, in a big pen outside, you're going to have piglets that are going to run back and forth across those huts. But each hut is going to be kind of like a mini housing unit for that sow and her piglets. And so that sow is going to go to her hut, and that's going to be a separate housing. She's probably going to not let other sows in there. Whereas if you have a big building, a single roof over a big pen, and you have a lot of sows in a big pen, the sows are going to tend to want to lay a little bit together. They'll want to keep their litter with them, but they'll lay a little bit together because they may or may not be cold in a big building like that. And that's where we have that increased potential for laying on all those other pigs. So that's kind of what I mean by separate versus non-separate. You want to create that sow and litter their own space where another sow isn't really going to be welcome in that space to keep piglets from being laid on. Ideally, that's done with a pen. So if you have a big building and you want to put all your sow and litters in a big building, you use pens to separate them off. A wall can be really useful as well. So not just your standard woven wire, but something that's really solid to keep those piglets from squeezing between all the different pens. For the second question, can you have farrowing sows in the same building as a boar if a separate pen? You can do that. There are people that house their boars in with their sows. In farrowing, your sow is an estrus. She's not cycling. The thing you'll want to be worried about here is bringing her into heat later, and you may desensitize her to that boar during that farrowing time. So she might get used to his scent. So you'll want to separate them at least for a short period of time before you wean that sow, so that when she is ready to come back into heat, weaning will trigger estrus to start again. You'll want to have some novelty of that boar so that she's not too used to them, and she'll still give you a strong heat response. But in general, if we're talking about just housing strictly from a temperature welfare perspective, I don't see an issue with keeping a boar in the same physical building as farrowing, as long as there's good pen separation, sturdy pen separation.
All right, are there any last minute questions?
Those were very good questions. Thank you. Do I have any sizing recommendations? Thanks, Jen. That was one of the questions I was trying to avoid. Sizing for pigs is going to depend quite a bit on your breed. So I can't recommend sizing for housing in a situation like this, because I don't know if you have guinea hogs or if you have landrace sows, and that's going to be a very, very big pig size difference, and that's going to be your starting consideration when drawing up your housing. How many pigs do you have and how big are they? So I highly recommend that you go to this site for building plans. It does offer some suggestions on sizing for things like, you want to have 4 farrowing stalls. And so it'll tell you how big the farrowing stalls would be in their example, and then you can back calculate if you need less space. Outside of that, the rest of the discussion is stocking density when it comes to sizing recommendations. So farrowing, you usually have so much space for sow and her offspring. For a farrowing pen, it's recommended to be anywhere between 7 square feet of space for the sow versus, or no, 7's not right. That's not right at all. I'm sorry. I'm completely blanking on that number. I'm only coming up with finishing numbers right now. I apologize. But at any rate, there's a general recommendation for that size, but it's built for a very, very large sow. So those recommendations are based on that landrace Yorkshire cross. For that farrowing unit, but outside of that, it depends on the number of pigs you're going to have in a given space and what size those pigs will be on for that sizing recommendation. If you're housing pigs where they have outdoor access, you also need to take into consideration how much exposure they're going to have to the land. So how much potential there is for them to rip up the land. To get started, if you don't have a pig facility at all, start with these building plans. Because they have a really good template for, okay, this is the situation that this building is set up for, and then you can go back from there. If you have pigs, you need to start with what you already have, and then see if you need more space and make adjustments from there. Exactly. Grazing animals per acre question, same thing. There's a lot of variables. It's really hard to give a straight recommendation.
All right. Well, if there's no further questions, I just want to sincerely thank you, Dr. Hines, from all of us for this presentation. And I'd like to remind everyone that next Thursday at the same time, we have our final webinar in the series, and it will be on breeding stock nutrition. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.